Brilliant to see you all. Really thrilled to have Dr. Catherine McGregor with us today. Catherine and I have been talking for several months through the pandemic. It sometimes feels like years, it sometimes feels like yesterday. But Catherine is hugely experienced in working with lawyers and attorneys, GCs, in terms of a lot of the key sort of business skills that aren't necessarily developed in law school. So really, really delighted to have her with us today, leading the session. I'm not going to take up any more time. I'm going to hand over to Catherine. It's all yours. They're all yours.
Great. Thanks, Keith. And today, as billed, I'm going to talk about influence. Influence is a significant skill for everyone. It's a significant skill for every lawyer. But what if your seniority, or indeed lack of seniority, doesn't necessarily automatically confer influence through your job title or your position in your law firm? How can you then develop it and best deploy it? And I think as well, it'll be interesting, does a title, does a position always automatically confer influence on you? I'd argue that there are other factors you need as well. But I'd like to start with a little bit of an icebreaker that we will do via the chat, if that's okay with everyone. Does everyone have access to the chat function? And what I'd like you to do is just to write in the chat somebody that comes to your mind as influential. They don't have to be someone you know. They can be somebody famous. They can be somebody who's not even alive, if they might be incredibly influential. But just jot down some names of who comes to mind in terms of being influential, wielding influence. They don't have to wield influence for the greater good, whatever that means, depending on your point of view, of course. We've got some, Meryl from Mackrell International HQ, so that's great. Dominic Shelton from Leipzig. Mackenzie Scott, yes, Jeff Bezos's ex-wife, very, very wealthy woman, and deploying that, arguably giving lots of it away. So very influential. Who says, Warren Buffett, again, yes, very influential investor. Elon Musk, incredibly influential. Every time he tweets about Bitcoin, something seems to happen. Keith Heddy, I have to agree with that. Legend in his own lifetime, of course. John Lennon, yeah, of course. Elon Musk again. Elon's quite popular. Yeah. I don't know if anybody's seen the story that was Michelle Obama, of course. Yeah. Interestingly, Michelle Obama often comes up in these sessions, and it's quite interesting when we think about the fact that she didn't necessarily have a position of conferred power. It was very much through association and much more in terms of what she did, as Steven Pinker, David Attenborough, of course, incredibly. And David Attenborough has been suggested by our very own influencer, Meryl from Mackrell HQ. So an influencer suggested by an influencer, great. Well, I think you get the idea then that there's lots of different people who can be influencers. There may be people there may be very famous people. And many of these embody a number of different qualities and ideas that I'm going to talk about today in this session. And what we'll do in this session is I'll talk for a little bit, not too long, hopefully. If you do have questions or comments, feel free to chime in with those via the chat, while I'm talking, and I will happily break off to answer those. We're then going to break into breakout rooms to actually work through a case study, which is based on a sort of composite variety of real life scenarios I've come across to actually discuss how we might suggest that the group in the case study deploys influence more effectively. So to get started, I am going to share a PowerPoint, if I am able to do that. Can I share my screen, Keith? is that, there we go. There we are. Right. Oh, I've done a nice little title page. So getting quite creative with my design skills as ever. So influence. I think often we think about influence as something that we're wielding upwards if we're not in a senior role, that we're trying to influence those who may have power over us, who can make decisions about our careers. But that's not always the case. We do need to take a much broader view of influence, in fact, a 360-degree view. And Herminia Ibarra of the London Business School, who's written an awful lot about leadership, and she's the author of a fabulous book called Act Like a Leader, Think Like a Leader, which I do highly recommend to anybody thinking about leadership, and I would argue that everyone should think about leadership. But she says that managers making their way up the leadership pipeline often tend to manage up, forgetting that it's their connections to the layers below that's often what makes them invaluable to seniors whose sponsorship they hope to attract. Now, I think what we should layer into that as well is the influence that you have laterally, because often as lawyers, I do a lot of work with in-house lawyers, as Keith said. A lot of the time, in-house lawyers are having to influence their peers. They're having to influence people who are at the same level as them in the organisation. Often as well, obviously in a law firm, you're having to influence your peers as well, people who may be in other practice areas, people who you may collaborate with. Indeed, in a situation like Mackrell International, where you're in a network, a key component is collaboration. How do you work together effectively across your network? How do you collaborate? Influence is a key component skill in effective collaboration. And an interesting anecdote, I was working with a GC recently who was telling me about a member of his team who is possibly the worst example of what Herminia Ibarra is talking about. This guy is completely fixated on continually influencing leadership in the organization. Every action, every utterance from this individual is about how do I influence people above me. The sad thing for him is what that means is everybody he works with pretty much hates him and doesn't like to collaborate with him. So it's a bit of a known goal, really, because in terms of being an effective team member, it's not really working very well. And indeed, what one of the metrics that the management is using and measuring is how effective you collaborate and how effectively you work with others. I'd like to now go on and talk a bit about some of the building blocks of influence. And these are all ideas that I research and think about a lot, and which I term human-centered business skills. I'm probably not the first person to come up with that terminology. Maybe I am, maybe I'm not, but I use it a lot. And I use the phrase human-centered business skills in opposition to the more popularly used soft skills, because I frankly hate the phrase soft skills, because I think it suggests that these skills are a little bit optional, they're a bit fluffy, they're not actually that important. Whereas actually, if you look at influential organizations, influential leaders, and increasingly the sort of work that's being done in the business community, it's been seen that these are actually the human-centered skills are the core differentiators between success and failure, particularly as our business and legal worlds become more digitized, because there's lots of stuff that machines are going to be able to do that we do now, but what the machines can't do is this human-centered stuff, or at least not yet anyhow. So what I'm going to talk through is the notion of credibility, connection with others, knowing your audience, body language, and also using passion and ideas outside of your remit or your day job. Credibility and knowledge is often the most logical and the easiest way that we gain influence. And that's really often the institutionalized influence that we are given. It's conferred through our expertise, it's conferred through our job title, it's conferred through particular qualifications we may have. Those are all great up to a point, But as with everything, it's not just what you have, it's how you use it that is incredibly important. So, a key point with this is all of these ideas start to blend into one another. Credibility is only useful if you can make it relatable, if you can make it understandable to those you are trying to influence. People will struggle to be swayed by an argument if they can't understand it. And I think, for example, in the still ongoing pandemic, but the pandemic, you could see a difference between, the scientists that were being put in front of the media versus those who maybe were more scientific. Part of the key is being able to talk credibly, but also talk in an understandable way about some of these key scientific issues. And if we think from a purely legal perspective as well, many of the clients that you will work with may not be lawyers. Even if they are lawyers, they'll be lawyers working in-house. And the first thing that I hear from pretty much every in-house lawyer I work with is that one of the first skills you need when you go in-house is knowing how to translate um, legalese into ordinary speak for your business clients. That this is almost, sometimes the number one skill needed by an in-house lawyer. And I think, obviously, as lawyers, you're encouraged to be incredibly good, great experts at what you do. You're encouraged to specialize from an early age, early part of your career, become experts in a particular area, whatever area of law that may be. But the training and experience can often encourage lawyers to demonstrate expertise and show all the workings because you know so much about what you do. However, increasingly, to be influential, and whether that's influential as a lawyer or influential as any sort of expert, being able to be concise and to the point will actually get your argument across much more effectively. And what this also links to as well is another really, really key point around influencing, which is connecting to individuals as individuals, frankly. People listen more to people, not to job titles or expertise. And it's interesting that some experts on influence have said that, one of the key factors can be actually people knowing who you are. Can you really influence if people are wondering who you are as you start talking? Some of it maybe actually have been made a connection with those that you're trying to talk to. And making a connection with colleagues as individuals and on a human level will help with influencing. And if we think about, hypothetically, a lawyer who is trying to influence a client to a particular course of action, if the client feels that the lawyer has their best interests at heart, if the client feels that the lawyer really understands their industry, really understands the particular challenges that their industry is facing, and perhaps even really understands them as a person, and some of that may be connecting on a very human level, being able to say, oh, Keith, I understand that you went on holiday recently. How was that? Sort of being able, Keith didn't go on holiday recently, obviously, because he works all the time, but that it was a case of, knowing something and remembering something about that person. So making a connection with colleagues as individuals and on a human level will help with influencing, because what people will do is they will assume good intent to your purpose. They will assume that if you're telling them something, you have their best interests at heart. Of course, we can tell from some popular examples that this is not always the case. Sometimes why individuals are very influential is because they seem as though they have other people's best interests at heart, but actually they may not. And we can insert the examples of whoever we feel appropriately conforms to that. But actually, the technique of being able to make people feel as though you have their best interests at heart is certainly something that really holds sway in terms of influencing them. But of course, if you're doing it in an organizational setting, a key aspect is to be authentic. And indeed, if you're trying to do it from a business development point of view as a lawyer in a law firm trying to gain business, of course, being authentic is going to be key. And I think if we think about people who do telesales, there's often a sense of they will try and connect with the people they are selling to. Now, when that's done incredibly well, it is incredibly effective. And why it's effective is because it seems authentic. It seems like they really do care about what happened to your sports team, or how your family is doing, or how you're feeling and experiencing the weather this particular day. When it's done ineffectively, it can feel like they're reading from a script, or that they don't really care, or they're just going through the motions. So, as much as possible, trying to actually make a real connection with people will essentially bank up some really great credits for when you actually need to influence them further down the line. And what is incredibly connected to that is the notion of knowing your audience. Research has shown that knowing your audience helps with effective influence, and there's an interesting study which is completely legally focused. I don't know if anyone on the call is an IP lawyer, but there was some research done a few years ago with patent litigators in the US, patent trial litigators, who it was found that when they actually researched and knew the judges that they were appearing against, and importantly understood what the judges responded to. So again, we're kind of going back to that point about communication with the credibility, knowing how to really get your point across, knowing whether it's facts, data, or emotions that will sway your audience more, or is it actually a mix of all three? Perhaps if you don't know your audience, a safe bet is to use a mix of all three in different proportions. But for example, it was found that if a judge was somebody who responded incredibly well to facts and figures, the litigators that used facts and figures more in their arguments were going to have a slightly more positive result. Their arguments were seen as more influential. Similarly, if a judge was more likely to respond to the human side, to the human emotional cost in a particular case, the difference it might make to the plaintiff or the defendant, the work that they had put into developing this particular piece of innovation that was now that the patent was being challenged, and so on and so forth, was that the thing that would sway the judge the most? And knowing that helped these lawyers tailor their arguments in such a way that it did gain more influence. And what this really comes down to is a key life skill and a key business skill, that of empathy. Famously in perhaps one of the most iconic legal novels ever, How to Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, Atticus Finch says to his daughter, "You never really understand someone else until you walk in their shoes." That's obviously a great descriptor of empathy. And understanding someone else's point of view is often key in really being able to then craft your response to them or your approach to them. And it's interesting, if anybody is very following ideas around innovation, around disruption in the legal profession and in business more generally, you may know that a key technique that's being used in business and now increasingly in law is design thinking. Which of course came originally from designers, but is now used in a number of different contexts. And there are a number of different stages to design thinking. The first stage is empathy. And that is actually the most important stage. It's interesting that Tim Brown of IDEO, who is one of the pioneers of design thinking, said that a danger with the technique of design thinking is that many people who are expert in a particular area, again, we go back to that point of credibility, you really know what you're talking about, there can be an assumption that you can skip the empathy stage. It's not that important. We know what we're talking about. We're here to solve your problem. We want to get straight to the solution. So we're going to skip the empathy stage. We're going to move straight to the next stage, which is ideation. We're going to come up with lots of ideas, and then we're going to try and rush to find the ideal solution. But, says Tim Brown, you've actually missed the most important point. That is really trying to step into the other side's point of view, really trying to walk in their shoes, because that will really influence your problem solving abilities. And the same, I would argue, is actually crucial as well for influence. Really understanding, the point of view, the ideas, the strategy that the people you're trying to influence may have, that you need to take into account. That will really all work together to bring your audience with you. And a really key semantic point, which I've come across in a number of different books on influencing and articles on influencing, it's very simple, but it's surprising how often it isn't used. It's just using we, not I. So, for example, instead of saying, I think that the organisation should do this, rephrasing it to say, if we do this as an organisation, we will be much more effective for X, Y, and Z reasons. Because again, that builds this sense of connection, it builds the sense of being in it together. And it also gives a certain amount of agency to your audience. They feel like they're not just being told what to do, they're not just being passive, they're making the decision with you. It's kind of it's a collaboration, it's a co-creation. Body language is more important than ever. I would probably advise against adopting the stance that the gentleman in my illustration is using, possibly not the most credible one. But if we think about it, body language is something we take for granted, and it's actually become incredibly important in the virtual world. So a key thing is to make sure that we're sitting up straight, we're standing straight if we're in person, but that shoulders are back, you're looking confident, you're looking in control. With the virtual world, it's incredibly easy to focus on the people on our screen. Of course, the key thing to do is to try and look at your camera. That's the equivalent of maintaining eye contact. It's actually incredibly hard to do, as I'm sure people have realized. It's key as well, if we're trying to influence, to be completely focused, particularly in a virtual setting. If we're looking at our phone, if we're looking at notes, we may sometimes need to do this, but trying to make sure that we're not doing it all the time so that the audience just isn't getting a view of the top of our head. That's not, the top of there's nobody who's the top of their head is going to be the most influential part of them. I'm absolutely 100% sure of that. But also, interestingly, apparently using your hands is a good thing to do virtually. I was very happy about this because you may have noticed I use my hands a lot, and I was quite worried that the experts would say that you shouldn't use your hands on Zoom meetings or virtually. But apparently it's really good to do it because it gives you more credibility, because it looks more natural. It's what we would do in real life. Just sitting statically doesn't make us look as in control, as at ease with our subject matter as if we try to be a bit more fluid and use gestures where we can. And finally, passion, which might sound a strange phrase to use in a business and legal context, but if we think about a lot of the themes that I've discussed, making connections, becoming known, showing that you're interested, making connections outside of your job remit can be a really effective way to gain more influence within your organisation, and potentially even outside of your organisation. So, as I said, a key question people can ask if you're trying to influence people is, who is this up there? Well, the more connections you make, the broader your network, the more that people are going to say, oh, that's Catherine, or that's Keith, or that's Meryl, for example. And a great way to broaden your network naturally is shared projects outside of your remit that will broaden the network and therefore broaden the influence. And projects which inspire others, such as ESG, DEI, can be a great way to expand network and influence. And you can probably think of things that in your own situation, in your own jurisdictions, might be effective. A number of clients that I've worked with have really developed great relationships with some of their law firms through shared projects, shared initiatives around things that are not directly connected to the law. Again, that shows from the connection point of view that the service providers, the law firms, are interested in some of the same passions that drive their clients. They're in it together. They're working for a shared goal, a shared cause. That's going to make the law firm that does that much more influential than the law firm that is purely transactional when it comes to influencing the client. So to summarize, do cultivate personal connections with colleagues and of course I would add clients as well, so that they assume positive intent when you attempt to influence them. Make it clear to your colleagues that you value their opinions, and take steps to develop expertise, passion outside of just your job function where you can, as a building block to building a network and indeed making stronger connections. Don't worry that your attempts to gain sway are manipulative. You're actually being strategic. Try not to slouch as you talk. Standing up or sitting up straight with your shoulders back helps you come across as confident and commanding. And don't use I too much. In a quest for influence, talking about how your ideas will benefit the entire organization or indeed network and how we will see value is always going to be much more compelling. And indeed, using that shared idea with clients can be incredibly compelling as well. Now I'd like to, I will stop sharing now and we will move to our breakout session. And I think Keith is going to be able to put everybody into...
Will do, but I did have a question come in.
Oh, yes.
Albeit from me.
Yes.
Which is, where's the balance then between influence and manipulation or perceived manipulation?
Well, I think some of it comes down, honestly, to the sense of connection and the sense of empathy. If you feel that the person influencing you really has your best interests at heart, whether that's necessarily completely 100% the case. But I think if we're thinking about it from a client service point of view, one would argue that, from an ethical point of view, lawyers will always try and have their client's best interests at heart. So understanding the client's situation, really being able to empathize with the client's situation, and then giving advice, trying to influence in a way that will be best for them. And I mean, I think where that can often come to the fore, sometimes it is obviously slightly easier in a private practice situation where the objectivity means the lawyer can just give legal advice. But I think often what sets the really great lawyers apart from the more average lawyers is those lawyers, and this is true in-house as well, who can really link the legal advice to a particular course of action or make suggestions as to how they think it will pan out for a particular client in regards to their situation. And I think when a client that in terms of the work I do with in-house lawyers, one of the biggest complaints I consistently hear is when private practice lawyers just give swathes and swathes of legal advice with no sense of direction or no sense of guidance. And often another key point, which gets back to our empathy connection point, is no sense of real understanding of that particular client's situation. An interesting anecdote, a GC I know very well, every year he shares with his key client relationship partners on his panel his strategic plan for his legal department. Every single year without fail, he gets 0 questions about this, 0 feedback about this, and indeed 0 indication that any of said client relationship partners have actually read his strategic plan. So what that's actually led to is him ditching some of those law firms because he feels they just don't have his best interests at heart because they're not connecting with him, they're not really understanding him. That's making their arguments, their influence in trying to persuade this client that they are indeed the best law firm for XYZ and to represent XYZ client a lot less influential because of that lack of connection. And indeed, I think that lack of empathy, that lack of connection, is making that influence in terms of business development actually seem more manipulative to that client, because it doesn't feel like they're invested in him. So I think ultimately it all comes down to this sense of understanding, empathy, and connection, versus just trying to focus transactionally on a means to an end. That would be my take on it, anyhow.
While I fiddle around with breakout rooms, what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign them automatically. Mm-hmm. So, surprise, you could end up with anybody. And I'm going to do it so there are 4 people per room. Catherine, how many would you like per room?
How many do we have? We have
we've got 20.
Five people per room.
Okie doke.
Yeah, I mean, if it's helpful, I can read through the case study as a group before we break into the breakout rooms, if we'd like to do that. So the case study is based on a sort of an amalgamation of real life scenarios all jumbled up together. But the case study, and I decided to go for an in-house, a client-focused one rather than a law firm-focused one, because I thought from a putting yourself in your client's shoes would be a good exercise. So we have an able group of lawyers who are in an in-house department, but they're finding it hard to influence and relate to, indeed, and influence the decision makers. That's the C-suite and the departmental heads. Previously, the general counsel was an incumbent of 20 years in that function, but this person who is not there anymore saw the legal team as a support function, very much in a reactive function. This view was shared by many of the C-suite, and indeed the legal team themselves started to share this view. The team therefore had previously worked in a very reactive way, responding to requests for contracts and advice as needed. But they do generally have a good relationship with many of their peers in other functions, as it's quite a collegiate environment and company. The new general counsel wants to ensure that the legal team is seen as strategic partners. She wants them to be more involved in meetings where ideas are discussed and decisions are made, because it seems that at the moment they're often being told after the fact. And then it's harder, of course, to influence the business folks in terms of, that's actually not a good idea or that's not legal, because they've become more invested in their strategy. The lawyers in the team who remain are masters of their subjects and have great institutional knowledge of the business. But the culture that developed under the prior GC means they're a bit reserved and they're a bit intimidated by authority. They're intimidated by the business functions. They're uncertain how to operate within formal hierarchies or to grasp fleeting opportunities for interaction. So their communication skills are lagging behind their intellectual powers and indeed their knowledge and so forth. So that limits their impact. It's damaging to the team's morale, obviously, but it also just poses a fundamental legal and business risk, because it may mean that the strategies are going to be insufficiently grounded in legal and business risk analysis. So yeah, it's quite a high stakes problem potentially for our new GC. So what I'd like you to do is, in your breakout groups, and we'll probably do this for a sort of about 25 minutes, just discuss. I've given some questions for the group to consider. How can the new general counsel encourage her team to become more influential, and what are some practical strategies she could try? Who should the team influence? Are there any obvious ways the team could try to start using influencing tactics in what they do? And if there was just one influencing tactic the team could focus on to make a difference in the short term, what would it be and why would that be? So Keith, if you're able to put everyone into breakout rooms.
The arms were going, they were directing. It was like sort of Mumbai traffic direction.
Oh, no.
Yeah. All I say, thank God there wasn't a whistle. There were no whistles involved. But I said I'd give them one more minute.
Okay, great. Right. We were worried we were taking too long. So yeah, no, I think we.
In one of the groups, there was this most wonderful self-admitted, because obviously we're an international network, so we don't do any country or jurisdictional stereotyping at all. But Patrick from Germany was saying, Keith, don't worry, you will be very pleased. I have taken the German mindset and I have got everybody lined up with the amount of time they have and how we are going to progress the meeting. And everyone's going, it's great.
So Catherine, are you going to give us the answer and when the breakouts are done?
Oh well, I don't think there is necessarily a correct answer. I mean, I'll just invite people to share some of their thoughts. I don't know which of you would like to share our. Well, I think we've kind of come down at a sort of like at two different solutions that may happen simultaneously or may just be slightly staggered. Our kind of top down and bottom up. But yeah, Steve, would you like to share that, or Jacqueline, would you like to share our finding, our idea, as it were, our solution?
Sure, that's fine. Jacqueline, you want to?
Yeah, we need to give Jacqueline some
Yeah,
reason for staying
Jacqueline.
up so late.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think it's very, very gallant and quite appropriate, Steve. Jacqueline, yeah, you're staying up late. We need to keep you awake. Great. 7 seconds.
Do you generally find, Jacqueline, that you've got to? Do you generally find you've got to stay up later for work? Generally, does your working hours often flex later, or not so much?
If I'm staying up late, mostly is to attend the macro calls.
You're just trying to make me. You're trying to make me feel guilty.
I'm always pleased to.
Right. Can I just say one of the most encouraging things was the amount of arm waving, because Catherine said arm waving is very important. The amount of arm waving that was going on in the sessions, apart from the one hosted by Patrick, who said, you know, this is going to be very Germanic. We're going to be very focused. Brilliant. I think we are all back. I'll just double check. It looks like everybody's out. We may have had a casualty or two along the way, but Catherine, back to you again.
Yeah, great. Well, I just wanted, within the groups, if we could get, I should have actually said to do this when you're in your rooms, but if we could get somebody from each group to just share with the rest of the group what within your discussion you settled on as being the one influencing tactic that the team could focus on to make a difference in the short term. What would that be and why? And we can kick off with our group, and Jacqueline's going to just share what I think we sort of had a bit of a split focus, but what we thought about and why that was. So Jacqueline, do you want to fire away?
Sure. So we couldn't decide on one, but we came up with two. Basically, I think I would call the first one the top-down approach and the second one the bottom-up, ground-up approach. For the top-down approach, it would be for the head of legal to speak to C-suite or to try and implement or create opportunities for her team to be more involved in the business operations. The ground-up approach would be really to perhaps to give the lawyers an opportunity to sit in meetings with the business operations to slowly build their confidence to be involved. To really utilize, I think, the relationship that they have with their peers to influence them and show their capabilities to give solutions beyond just legal advice and to give practical solutions to the business problems.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Have we got another group that's able to share? Keith, I think you might have better visibility on who is in which group.
Well, Well, Patrick, since you were the leader of the group in Germanic style, I'm not going to get you to do it, but I'm going to allow you to nominate somebody from your group to share.
I think Simeon.
Good choice.
Can talk about that.
Hey everyone. So we had a nice discussion in group 1 about what are the best techniques for influencing another in our group, and in a way so everyone could be in good benefit of the team. And we discussed 3 main topics. The first one is the we talking that we discussed in the very beginning of this presentation. Patrick shared this is something as a rule number 1 in his law firm about the we talking, and it's not something only for talking inside the law firm, but also with talking with clients and discussing their legal aspects and problems as our problem. We are about to do this, and so on and so forth. The second thing that we discussed is an opportunity for everyone in a work group to present a way for dealing with the problem, and after that having an open discussion for the pros and cons of each of the aspects that were proposed. And of course, the third to be honest, I forgot the third thing that we discussed. So if Patrick could or Pamela could back me up, it will be of great use. And sorry, I just
maybe Anwar remembers. Anwar, do you remember?
What's that?
I was going to pitch it to Anwar.
Maybe I could just chip in a little bit on the teamwork. It's almost an emphasis on the using of we instead of I, but I guess we also touched on teamwork and how it helps in building up team spirit and influencing one to just feel as part of the team.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm going to go to our wonderfully international team, which is the Dominican Republic, London, Tanzania, Tawa, I'm not sure where you are, and Guernsey. And there was, I think I may nominate Cáceres Torres, because I mean, there's 3 of you that were being very, very lively. But obviously it is a team effort. It is a we, so why don't you start, and then others can chip in afterwards.
Oh, okay, hello. So I would say that the shared comment in our group 3, was pretty much to promote an empathic and safe environment where points can be discussed and the lawyer's confidence can be enriched. So that was pretty much the point where we all agreed in group 3. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks.
Any other comments from your group? Joanna, Kemi, Tawa, or Tian? Great. Okay, then we will go to the exotically named room 4, where I'm going to ask Olivia, just because she was the most animated of the arm wavers, to
Good to know. I don't think I realized. It's interesting, Catherine, when you were talking about gesturing, I thought, oh, I don't think I gesture. I'm wrong. Apparently I gesture. Yeah, you came in right when I was talking, but everybody, we had a great group. Everybody was really contributing with really interesting stuff, and Bill's worked in-house as GC. So that was good to have sort of an insider knowledge. I think what we ended on is just, if you want to get buy-in in this use case, in this scenario, you really need to get the lawyers in the room with the C-suite in this case, or whoever's the business side of things, and have sort of a threshold discussion about how we can better support them. What do they consider being a wall or blockers preventing them from wanting the lawyers to be in the room. So it's almost a cop-out, but communication, you need to get in a room and ask them, what are your goals? What are your North Stars? How do you want to be supported? You know, basically, what are your preferences here and how we support you? And once you can be on the same page about that, Dave mentioned, you know, people will contribute to what they helped create. So if they can help create with you the dynamic, how should we be working together? Then that's all you need is that foundation. Or I shouldn't say that's all you need, but having that foundation will allow you to influence moving forward, because they've agreed almost on the parameters of how you will be influencing. So
yeah. And is that all the groups, Keith? Did we have 4 groups? Yeah, great. I didn't want to like exclude anyone from that. Yeah, I mean, it's funny that there obviously isn't a right answer to this. It is a scenario, and there are a number of different approaches that could be taken. I mean, I think it's interesting that a number of the groups focused on the fact that you do need to build up, you know, you need to have the culture, but you also need to have the confidence built up within our legal team so that they feel able to influence, and that just almost to sort of throw them in a scenario where they're having to influence, like throwing them in the deep end, could be quite difficult for them. And there's always the danger that if they feel overwhelmed by that and they don't feel that they're able to contribute to a conversation, the top-down scenario could then backfire, because you know, the CEO might say, well, we tried having your legal folks in the meetings and they didn't, you know, it didn't work. They were completely useless, or whatever it may be. So often it's a multiplicity of approaches, but really this sort of notion of communication and connection is key. And you know, certainly in our group, we talked about the fact that the fact that they have quite collegiate relationships with many of their peers is a really good starting point for maybe leveraging that into some more influential activities in the business meetings. What I was saying to the group I was in, that one of the inspirations for this scenario was actually a GC that I've done some work with, and she was in a very similar situation when she entered her new function. And what she did was actually she wanted to get her heads of legal into strategic business meetings, and she framed it with her peers, who were the CEOs of the different business units, as a learning opportunity for her lawyers, you know, saying she really needed to develop them. And it would be really helpful if these lawyers just came to the business meetings and observed, which they did do. And her messaging was very much, well, do observe, do listen, really try to understand what's going on, and then at a certain point start to make suggestions, but make sure you don't limit your suggestions purely to just legal advice. Start to suddenly, you know, talk to the group as peers, which of course was a very subtle, very incremental approach. But you know, it's a bit like the lawyers became a bit like a piece of furniture in the room. The business people had become used to them being there, and eventually, you know, it almost became, well, you know, oh, we can't have the meeting because we haven't got our lawyer here. So it very you know, gradually completely changed the mindset, and that, you know, almost again approaching the business leaders in not like you need to have a lawyer in the room, with the notion that you need to have the lawyer in the room because you might all be doing illegal stuff without us to mind you, might, you know, immediately would get someone's back up, but doing it more of a, you're doing me a favor, you're kind of helping my personal development of my team, suddenly put our business leaders who are being asked this in a slightly different mindset. You know, it's like, oh yeah, okay, I understand that. I have my own talent development issues. So yeah. Well, I hope some of that was helpful, and yeah, we all want to be in the room where it happened. Yes. Any final thoughts or questions for me from anyone? I think I've put. I'll share the PowerPoint with Keith, and that's got my contact details. So if you do have any questions, you know, obviously feel free to or comments or thoughts, feel free to connect offline, and I'm happy to engage, you know, with any thoughts or ideas or questions you may have, or indeed, you know, if you have a particular influencing problem you would like me to weigh in on. Always happy to help.
I have one comment. Keith knew I'd have a comment probably. I think your point on empathy is very well taken. I also think that in gaining empathy, one of the biggest things, and sometimes I have a problem doing that, is listening. You know, if you're communicating, if you're talking to someone and you want to influence them, just coming out of the gate saying, this is how we should do it, that doesn't work often. It's one of the keys is listening to people. And that's how people, if you listen to them, they will believe that you are empathetic towards them.
Yeah.
And I think as lawyers, we, especially as a litigator, I spend my life talking, and learning to shut up and listen, you know, sometimes is one way to create that empathy, one way to communicate. But like you were suggesting, Catherine, with respect to the scenario, is the people in the meetings, there is a point they should listen initially, but there is a point at which maybe they can give a business or a non-legal, you know, legal input. So I think those are key. Communication is key. And I think in our group, I talked about the relationship between the C-suite and the legal department as being kind of like a marriage. You know, there has to be communication. There has to be listening.
Yeah, no, completely. And actually the listening point is really interesting. I mean, the empathy is just such a massive topic, and one I love talking about just generally. But the you know, a thing that people can do if you really want to come across, make your listening much more clear, is to use active listening, which is when you repeat aspects of what's just been said back to the person. That not only emphasizes in your own mind what you've heard, but also makes it clear to the other party that you have heard them. And apparently this has been, you know, when this is used in conflict resolution, it comes to a much quicker resolution than when people are just passively listening. And another interesting anecdote is some years ago I read a book actually by a chap who is or was, I think, the chief hostage negotiator for the Metropolitan Police. And it was fascinating because obviously lots of, you know, his work, very fraught work indeed, you know, dealing with terrorists, dealing with people who are taking hostages. And he said, you know, I often get the first question people often ask me is, you know, in a hostage situation, what do you say to diffuse it? And he said, actually, it's not about what I say, it's about what I hear. That the most important thing I do is listen, not, you know, it's the listening is key, because what's often led people to these extreme scenarios of taking hostages or whatever is feeling that they are not being heard. So that lack of empathy becomes key. And hopefully in our day-to-day business lives, it will never lead to a hostage taking scenario of any sort of shape or form. But just as an extreme example, I think the empathy point, the understanding, the connection, and then that leads to so many other good things like communication, you know, great seed for being able to talk to people, being able to share ideas. So yeah, very, very, very key. Right, well, I think we can finish a few minutes early, which is always great for everyone. And certainly for Jacqueline, who's getting very late for her there. So sorry about keeping you up, Jacqueline. Thank you for joining us.
Catherine, thank you so much. I actually just want to pick up on John's point, because it's very interesting, because I haven't worked, I mean, I work with Meryl and Pam sort of cheek by jowl, or nowadays screen by screen, but I actually work with John and it's interesting that for John to say that he's a litigator and is a talker. John is part of the international committee, the executive board that runs the network. And it's fascinating to hear John say that, because I don't see John as a talker. John is one of those people on that board that actually does an awful lot of listening. But actually, when he speaks, it's because he's got something that is important to be said. And, and that probably comes from, an awful lot of litigation and experience of having done that. But certainly, I think that there is a key scenario in the network where it's a board of peers looking after a network of peers, and where influencing is an absolute key skill to represent a region, a network, and come to sort of a collegiate way forward, but also not simply turn every discussion into blamage with everybody agreeing with each other. It does happen occasionally, but it's interesting you say that, John, because it's certainly my experience of you on the IC is someone who doesn't say a lot, but when you've got something to say, you've done a lot of active listening, and it comes out very strongly, very, very powerfully. But I hope what everybody's got out of today is not only some thoughts provoked and some synapses stirred by what Catherine has said, but the chance to meet people in different jurisdictions around the world, wave your arms around a little bit, hear some different perspectives, and do some thinking. So I will share Catherine's PowerPoint. She is available. We're hopefully going to get her back later on in the year to do a session on, we haven't decided yet. We may actually put it to this group. You may influence that decision in terms of whether it's collaboration, or how do you find the empath in a lawyer, but we'll come back to that. But most of all, thank you so much for joining us. Catherine, huge thank you to you.
Thank you. It's lovely to
stay
meet
safe.
you. Thank you.
and we'll see you soon.